Contracts, Part 2, and we are off. Let's review what we did in the last lecture, and we talked about terminology for contract formation. We looked at agreement, we looked at consideration, contractual capacity, legality, the genuineness of assent, objective theory of contract, and form. Now, we didn't look closely at agreement or consideration. I think we pretty well know what form is now. We looked closely at the objective theory of a contract, and this one is fairly self-evident, genuineness of assent, and the legality is fairly easy to understand. Contractual capacity means that they're legally competent to enter into an agreement. The two that we really need to look at that has more detail would be agreement and consideration. So that's what the next few minutes will be about. So, before you can have an agreement, you have to have an offer. And this is kind of what entails within that agreement. To have an offer, the offerer and the offeree, there have to be two parties, obviously. There has to be a promise to do or refrain from something specific in the future. The elements necessary for an effective offer, before you can have an agreement, is there has to be a serious intent by the offerer. There have to be definite terms so that it can be enforced either by the parties or by the courts. And there has to be a communication of that offer to the offeree. So that kind of gets us started. Let's look into some of the terminology that's used for the intent for the offer. The first one would be intent. Are they serious about this? Do they really want this offer or this agreement or offer to exist? So how serious is the intent? And to determine that, it's what any reasonable person in the offeree's position would conclude that the offerer's words or actions meant. That means, would a reasonable person believe that that was a true offer? Did it make sense? If that is the case, then you have good intent in the offer. Obviously, offers made with anger or jest or undue excitement, they don't meet that test and probably wouldn't stand up in court. If you have expressions of opinion, that's not an offer. The book gives an example of a doctor's opinion that a hand would heal within a few days. That's not a contract, that's not an offer, it's just an opinion. Statements of future intent. If you are angry at your car, as many people sometimes get, and say, I would sell this for $500. That's not an offer, that's just a statement of future intent, possibly. If bids are requested, you can put a bid in. That doesn't mean they're going to accept it. That's just the kind of the first step, I guess, of maybe an agreement, but it's not an offer. Advertisements, catalogs, and circulars. Many people think, well, if that's what you advertise it for, that is what you have to sell it to us for. That's not necessarily true. An advertisement or a catalog just gets it out there. Okay, that's saying it is for sale. Neither is a price list, and a lot of price lists actually say prices may be subject to change. So, don't, just because it says $2 doesn't mean that's what it's going to be. Now, you have to make sure that the offer has definite terms in it, so you can determine if there's been a breach of that contract. And the definite terms we're looking for is identification of the parties, who's making the offer, who's receiving the offer, identifications of the object or the subject matter of the contract, the consideration to be paid, the value to be exchanged, and usually the time of the payment, when it's going to be delivered, or when it's going to be performed. If those 4 items are there, then you have some definite terms that can be recognized by the court. And the final part of an offer is it has to be communicated. And if the offeree doesn't know it's been communicated, then it doesn't exist. So those are 3 things that have to happen for that offer. There has to be intent, there has to be definite terms, and there has to be communication. Now you can terminate an offer, and that can be done in various ways. It can be terminated by action of the offeror, as long as it hasn't been accepted. That can be revoked, so to speak. It can be terminated by the offeree. They can reject it. They can counter offer. They can ask about an offer. Okay, but asking about an offer doesn't necessarily reject it. Or they can do a counter offer, which kind of terminates the first offer and creates a new offer. And the offer can be terminated by the operation of law, or by simply having it be against a statute, or by the destruction of the subject matter before it's offered. Let's say I offer to sell my truck, and before that offer is accepted, it's been totaled. Well, the offer is no longer valid. Or if there's a death or incompetence on either party, that can make it terminate the offer. Again, as I said, it could be by statute or court decision. Or if there was a specified time for that offer to be accepted, that would be a lapse of time. If that time runs out, then the offer would be terminated. And there's some kind of specific details on when that lapse of time may occur. Typically, the offer is terminated automatically when the time specified in the offer has passed. Got that? The time begins to run when the offeree receives the offer, not when it's sent. If the offer is delayed, and the period begins to run from the date of the offeree, the period of it runs from the date that the offeree received it, but only if they know there's a delay. If no time specified, the offer terminates at the end of a reasonable period of time. Destruction or death, and again that kind of fairly well explained that. If it's destroyed before the offer is accepted, there is no offer. And if there is somebody who's incompetent or somebody dies, the offer is no longer valid. There's something called irrevocable offers, and that's where the offeror promises to hold the offer open for a specific period of time in exchange for payment. Sort of like I will a retainer. Possibly, I don't know if I call it a retainer. I would, let's say I wanted to buy land, and I wanted them to hold it for 3 months, and I give them $3,000 to do that. That is an irrevocable offer. Now the acceptance, when we get to that, has to be voluntary. There can be no force in accepting that. There can be no threat. Usually, if you've got a good offer, you're going to get it unequivocally accepted, and that's kind of required by the mirror image rule, which I will explain in a later lecture. And if the offer is accepted but there are additional conditions put on it, then that becomes a new offer, so then you have to start all over again. Sometimes silence as acceptance is acceptable, and typically that doesn't constitute acceptance unless the offeree takes benefit of the services offered, whether they've had the opportunity to reject or accept, either one, or if there's been prior dealings and it's just kind of a given. It's okay that silence will be an acceptance. In a unilateral contract, there's no communication of acceptance is generally necessary, because the acceptance is normally, evident. Now, there may need to be some communication if it's not evident to the offerer that the action has been or will be completed. In a bilateral, acceptance is necessary because it's a form of a promise, and if you don't have a promise, you can't have a contract. And then we go back to the mode and timeliness of that acceptance. There's a mailbox rule. The acceptance is effective when it is sent by the means authorized by the offerer. If you send it in a different manner than what the offerer requested, they may reject that. You also have authorized means. Let's kind of define that. They're usually specified by the offerer, and sometimes the contract is not formed unless the offeree uses it. If it's not specified, the authorized means of communication, you can use the same means of communication as used by the offerer to send it to you, or a faster means, and that would be acceptable. And a substitute sent by an unauthorized means is effective only upon receipt. Up here, it's when it's sent. For these, especially if you're sending it the way the offer requested. So you'll notice up here it says, let me find it. Acceptance is effective when it is sent, right here. Down here, if it's sent by an unauthorized means, it's effective upon receipt. And again, it could be rejected. Consideration, and that is a value given in return for a promise. We're talking money or a service or a task that we're going to do. There are two elements. One, is it legally sufficient in value? And two, is it a bargain for exchange? If it's a legally sufficient value, and that's something, it's a promise to do something that one has no prior legal duty to do. That means it's something extraordinary to that person. The performance of an action that is otherwise not obligated or undertaken, or the refraining from an action that one has a legal right to undertake. So, in a bargain for exchange is, how do they put that? They put this in here so that there is an exchange. There has to be a return for a promise. If I promise to give my daughters all of my land when I die, that's not a contract. If I promise to give my daughters all the land if they pay me $10,000, that could be construed as a contract because there's a bargain for amount of money in there. I think that made sense. And adequacy of consideration means the fairness of the bargain has to be evaluated. The courts will look and see, and if they think that it's not, they could invalidate that particular contract. Agreements that lack consideration. Pre-existing duty. It's kind of interesting, and an example of that would be there's a reward for a criminal, and the sheriff catches the criminal but then asks for the reward. That is a pre-existing duty, so there's no consideration to be taken into that. If there are unforeseen, there's some exceptions to this. Construction sometimes may have some unforeseen difficulties, and those even may be written right into the contract. If it is something that just goes with the territory for construction, usually the construction company is going to eat it. But if it's something that is totally unforeseen, that there's no way around it, let's say there is a change of zoning laws in the middle of building a construction, and it's going to cost $10,000 more to meet those zoning laws, more than likely you are going to have to pay that extra $10,000. That's through no fault of the construction. They couldn't foresee it. You have illusionary promises where they're kind of it's a contract expressed with such uncertainty of performance that a promiser cannot really actually promise it. It's sort of like, let's say at the beginning of the year, I say, if we have a really good year, I'm going to give everybody a $10,000 bonus if I decide to. You know, that's sort of like, that's not a promise at all. And finally, we have a settlement of claims, which talks about disputed contracts, and many times you want to settle these out of court. So they have about 3 ways of doing this, and the 3 ways are by accord and satisfaction, which is where they will sit down and come up with an agreement, and the debtor will usually pay less. And basically what that says is their satisfaction is a performance of the accord. Basic rule is no satisfaction unless there's first an accord. So they have to agreement, then they satisfy it. They can sign a covenant not to sue, but that doesn't bar further recovery, meaning they could ask for more money. A release is binding if it's secured and given in good faith, if it's signed in writing, and there's consideration given. And a release bars further recovery at all. And finally, the covenant not to sue just says, I won't sue you if you do this. It doesn't say I won't sue you at all. But there, it's binding if it's secure and given in good faith, it's signed, and consideration is given. And unlike a release, a covenant not to sue does not bar further recovery. And finally, we have something called promissory estoppel, which is a promise that we rely on, and it may not be written, but it's a promise that has been implemented. And a very good example of that is an employer orally promises to pay each of his employees $2,000 a month after they retire for the remainder of their lives. He does it for 2 years and then stops. They can take him to court and attempt to enforce that promise. It has to be a clear and definite promise. It has to, the promiser's expectation that the promisee will rely on the promise, and that's where it comes in. If you rely on that for the rest of your life, then that's built into a contract. The promisees act or refraining from act in reasonable reliance on the promise. There's definite reliance resulting in a substantial detriment to the promisee. He'd promised $2,000 a month. They continued working for him. In 2 years' time after retiring, they aren't receiving this money. That's a definite breach of contract. And justice better served by enforcement of the promise. So there are many, many ways to have contracts, which this is a very good example of. I will have a very short one on e-contracts, and this will finish up our chapter 5. Thank you. I shall see you, I guess it'll be Friday for this one.